did a comic for my project. I did this because I like comics and I just wanted to see what it was like to create and design my own comic from start. So what I did was I did what illustrators were, which comics are. They illustrate things, and I did research on what they do, and I did some collage on different styles and types of comic books, ranging from mangas, big little books, and different other styles. And from this, I decided what style I wanted to do my comic in. So yeah, I did some research on some artists and some people who design comics, and Stan Lee is one of the big people in comics. He is co-producer of Marvel Comics, and he basically is more or less the illustrator. And he gets artists to design his work and draw everything out for him. So yeah. Um, and then I did I showed the processes of comic books. So the initial stages would be penciling and rough sketches. So they would basically give it to the penciler to draw out the comic roughly, and then they will go over it again in the final product, and touch everything up. And then will be the inking, where it gets put onto Photoshop, scanned, and it's rendered on Photoshop and other softwares, and to add color to it, which is here. And this is some experimentation I did with rendering and inking. I also did research about the speech bubbles and what they do and how they are placed on the comic book so that nothing is too overcrowded, but there's enough information on the comic book for the person to know what the comic is about. And as you can see, there are different types of ways the bubbles are put on the comic. I did the comic book language, like basically it's just sound effects and things to really engage the reader, to tell them what's happening, to show them like noises that things would make in a comic book. And I did some research on the grid and how the grid was first started. So basically, the first comic book, the grid for comics, was a 9-panel grid where all the grids were even, and it went in the order from right to left, downwards. And as through the ages, manga has influenced the comic world in the Western part to change it up a bit and make it more like this, where they have uneven panels, so it'll be irregular, I think, regular panels. And this will allow the comic creators to think more about what they place on each panel, so that each panel has enough drawing and information on it, so that the pages flow nicely. This is an experimentation of the use of photographs into making a comic. So I basically went out with my friend and took a series of photos that I later turned into a comic book, where I took the images onto Photoshop, where I rendered them, changing them into black and white, and arranging them in a sequence, and then this is how, yeah, that. and then I did some perspective drawings for my comic book backgrounds. This is a few. I explored 1, 2, 3 point perspectives. And here are some other ones. Because of my comic book is set in sort of futuristic era, and it's a sort of torn up place, I decided to draw my perspective drawings like this and sort of add a sort of destructive feel to it, like it's gone. And then so I did some roughs for my front cover that I did. For this, I looked at some different comic book covers and to see like how comic book covers are made and what are the key parts of it. So for the first two, I decided to put or draw the city they're in to sort of like show an overview of what the comic is about without telling too much of what the comic is really about. And here I did some rough sketches for my final product. For this one I did an A4. I just drew a few panels out to see what it would be like in A4 in terms of how much detail I need to put in. And I switched it to an A5 because I thought maybe if the paper was a bit smaller, I would get away with just a few like details rather than having to overload it with so much. And these are some of my final sketches for the panels in the comic book that I designed. And here is a rough for my comic where I drew everything out and inked it all. Where I inked it all. And it took me some time to get the dimensions and inking right and all the weight lines right. It's not complete. My project was aimed specifically at a certain group of teenagers who have an interest for comics. They're people who like to read in their spare time, like to go out and socialize with friends at events like Comic-Con, where people can be themselves, just socialize, just do whatever they want without being judged. And
what's the story?
the story of my comic is set in urban Japan, where the country is divided by the poor and the rich, and the capital is ruled over by one supreme being. And it's about two characters who live in an orphanage who grew up at the time of after the war and see that people are being mistreated, so they go out their way to try and make everything in that area and that world equal, so people have equal rights, people are treated equally.
And what's the name of your hero?
Yeah, the heroes are Hiroshi and Ichiro.
Okay.
And the title of it was Shinchi, meaning warrior. Yes.
And have you got any drawings or sketches of your character?
I've got like one of them that I did. I did one of them that I did.
That's quite cool.
Yeah.
Have you got any questions?
What's your character's name?
Hiroshi. Nickname Hiro.
Like that.
Any other questions?
What was the inspiration for the story?
Inspiration was just my interest for manga and comics. Just constantly always thinking of creating or just making up stories. Because as a child I was like really bored. So I went out my way to find out what comics were and how manga just sort of came to be, and it sort of more or less molded my life in terms of what I do with it now. Like whenever I'm bored or there's nothing to do, I like to read a lot of manga, and because of that, I've read a lot of types of manga and comics, and from then I just decided to take bits and bobs from mangas that I've read and genres and put it all together. Any more?
Any more questions? What did you think about his project? Huh? Why? It was so good, but you don't know why.
What do you think of the presentation, Miss?
I think there's a lot of information missing. I mean, it would have been better if we had the full
Stop here, I swear.
the book.